Hey everyone, Brian DeBrain here, and it is week 2 of Brendan Fraser month in the 90s here at Pantheon Plus. And my co-host this week, of course, is Jerome Q Sons. You can find him on Twitter, Jerome C1985. And we appreciate all the reviews. You can give us 4 or 5-star reviews here at Pantheon Plus or at The Real World, and we really appreciate that. And I don't know, last week was kind of a rough start to Brendan Fraser in the 90s month. I know Encino Man was kind of a sort of controversial pick, I guess, but because of the historical nature of it and all the actors that were in it, that's why I chose it. And this week, I kind of chose this for the same reasons, except I grew up watching this movie, so this is very nostalgic for me. And I really liked this movie a lot as a kid because it was very silly and dumb for the 90s. And it is Airheads from 1994. And of course, it stars Brendan Fraser as well as Steve Buscemi and Adam Sandler. And Jerome, you had never seen this before. I have seen this at least 20 times up to this point in my life. A lot on TV. I know you'd never seen it before. I know you heard the cult status of it, I guess, sort of. But your overall first impressions of the movie with Chris Farley as a cop and 2 of the Ghostbusters playing cameos, and of course you got Brendan Fraser singing lead on this great punk song that was covered from 1984.
I went into this movie with a lot of high hopes because I know that this was a cult status movie. You got Steve Buscemi. You got Adam Sandler before he was a star. You've got, of course, Brendan Fraser. You've got a lot of... The thing to me with this movie is there are a lot of disparate parts in this movie that never quite come together. Like, you have an entire subset of Saturday Night Live people. You mentioned Chris Farley, Adam Sandler, one of the stars. That's not to mention the fact that you've got Michael McKean, who is also a part of Saturday Night Live. Also, clearly a nod to This Is Spinal Tap. The big cameo with Harold Ramis. And then you've got kind of the musical aspect of things with Rob Zombie. And Lemmy in this movie. You've got Judd Nelson, kind of a washed-up 80s actor. You got Michael Richards from one of the most popular sitcoms in the world at this point. You've got Joe Mantegna. For me, the issue with this movie is there are a lot of disparate parts, and none of it ever comes together. And it just doesn't ever feel like a cohesive movie. That, to me, is where I come down. I think there are some amusing parts to it. I like some of the direction by Michael Lehman. But at the end of the day, for me, this movie just doesn't work because it feels like the actors are on very different wavelengths. And they couldn't quite figure out the tone for this movie either.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And still to this day, I can, not a lot of the jokes land, obviously. But I'm still laughing. I'm guessing I'm laughing at more of the performances because these comedic actors are just so good that they can just deliver lines that are stupid and just nail them. You know what I mean? And we know that with Chris Farley. David Arquette has a cameo. I wouldn't even say a cameo. He has a small role in this. It's more than a cameo. He's got speaking lines. So, I mean, even in that sense, you mentioned him or actors being in a different movie than other actors in this movie. That's clearly one of them because there's some clearly... I mean, David Arquette in this movie's got to be on some kind of drug. I don't know what, maybe mushrooms, it seems like. Like, I don't know, but he was just so out of it in this movie. But yeah, just little things like that. But for me, what clicks is like the whole, the 90s feel to it. I love the look. I love the music, obviously. And I love just this commentary on rock and roll, which we'll get into a little bit. But just like this idea, it feels like every generation, which I think is true, that every generation, whether it's rock and roll, whether it's sports or basketball or wrestling or whatever, the old generation is always going to criticize the new generation, right, for something. And in this case, they were like, what does this 90s generation have to say? You know what I mean? And then, immediately Brendan Fraser's character Chaz claps back at the DJ. He's like, yeah, what did Jimi Hendrix have to say with Purple Rain? Or not Purple Rain, Purple Haze. And, Purple Haze is a notorious just drug song with not really any deep lyrics to it, nothing like a deep Beatles song. So I get that argument that, like, sometimes that, the older generation does criticize the new generation. And sometimes those, criticisms are not really, what they seem. So, I kind of stand with Brendan Fraser's character in this situation. But that kind of happens with every generation of rock and roll. I mean, Kurt Cobain, was kind of on the rise at this time, and they weren't even fans of grunge rock. They even make fun of grunge rock in this movie because this was '94. So there's a lot going on in terms of the rock scene. You got Kurt Lauderdale from MTV's in this movie, so a lot going on. But unfortunately, we mentioned the cult status. This was an $11 million budget, grossed $5 million, folks. That is bad. And I mean, in comparison, Encino Man was a much higher profit margin. So it's very weird. And then doing some research because there's not a lot of background to this movie, like not a lot of history or not a lot of stuff, but some recent articles have popped up because of Brendan Fraser's nomination. And Adam Sandler has gone on record saying that he pretty much lobbied to get Brendan Fraser on the movie. And Michael Lehman, the director, this is a quote. Like I don't get it. I don't see the caveman being in the movie. And again, that's that Encino Man, stink, so to speak. That like this caveman role didn't, if this movie didn't happen for Brendan Fraser, that Encino Man role as a caveman might have controlled his career for the rest of his life and typecasted him into those kind of roles where he could play a caveman or some kind of crazy person or something outlandish like that. But in this case, he lobbied for him, and Adam Sandler, saw the chemistry with Pauly Shore, and he's like, we can get that chemistry here. And I felt like they kind of captured some of that when the band was having their moments together, and I felt like Buscemi, Sandler, and Fraser have this good chemistry as the band themselves, and I feel like at least the beginning of the movie kind of captures that for you to kind of invest in them. But I don't know if you were feeling that, Jerome. But were you invested in these characters as I were, or were you just kind of like, I don't really care what happens to them at the end?
I had a really hard time caring, and I think part of it is kind of the early scene with Brendan Fraser and his girlfriend. I know I texted you about this. The movie kind of lost me in the first 15 minutes and didn't really get me back because that scene was just so aggressive and unfunny and very oddly placed. Like, you're trying to get me invested in this character, and you have him kind of being, and I know that this is very typical of the 90s and this kind of genre of movie where you got kind of the losers who are maybe sometimes lazy, sometimes dreamers. You want them to kind of be seen as underdogs, and I get all that, but this scene, just this version of that scene just didn't work for me, and I think that's part of how the movie lost me, and it's really unfortunate because, again, I think there's some good pieces to this movie, but I think that the pieces concept very much connects to this because even in that scene, I think Brendan Fraser is kind of on a different wavelength in terms of the performance as compared to Amy Locane's Kayla. So I think that's where that disconnect formed for me, was right even in that opening scene. And then once the so for me, Brian, the gold standard of hostage movies is Dog Day Afternoon. And it's one of those things where, I saw Dog Day Afternoon when I was a teenager at a very, like, in terms of like movie, like in terms of really expanding my palette for movies, like that was a really important one. And for me, that is like the gold standard of hostage movies. And if you're going to have a hostage movie, you better have something really interesting to say. And I think I get what they're going for. And part of it is I don't have as much of a connection to music in general as you do. So undoubtedly that creates a bias. But so perhaps if I did have some sort of a connection to rock and roll, then I could say, okay, I'm into this. Like, I can connect with Rob Zombie and Kurt Loder and Lemmy and all those people. But one of the early observations I had for Brian is there's a point when they go to a show, and I was like, this band looks and sounds exactly like Fozzy. The lead singer even looks and sounds like current day Chris Jericho, 2023 Chris Jericho. And that's not a compliment, by the way. So, that's kind of where I was with this movie. And again, it's just, I think that this movie has its moments. I'm not going to say it doesn't. Like, Mike Judge voicing Beavis and Butthead, like, that is a great nod to the 90s, and it's very amusing to me. I think Beavis and Butthead, like, them having some sort of a cameo in this movie makes a ton of sense. But then there's just a lot of other things that just don't work.
See, I think Amy Heckerling would have done a way better job than Mike Lehman because I think she would have captured like the heart and the inspiration and the, what's driving the band to getting that record played besides just playing it, just I'm doing this for you, Kayla. I'm doing this for us. Instead of that, I think Amy Heckerling would have got to the heart of it, and I think this is more her type of movie. Because I mean, I think the reason they picked Mike Lehman for this is because he did Heathers, and Heathers I haven't seen. I've seen a lot of like YouTube clips. I've never actually seen the whole thing, and I've seen some clips on TV. But if you get the vibe of Heathers, it's very like dark, teen, almost anti-teen comedy kind of thing, and it has a little bit of an edge to it. And this does. I mean, it's trying to have an edge to it, but it kind of leans into more of the Adam Sandler style comedy that what was to come, I think. So I think this was kind of like the precursor to those Adam Sandler style comedies because it's almost like that level. I don't think it gets to that raunchiness point that an Adam Sandler movie gets to in the later '90s, but it's close. But I think it still plays that line well, and it's not exactly overtaken by Adam Sandler and his shtick and his friends. He's just mainly like a supporting player. So that part I'm cool with because like usually Adam Sandler movies he takes over and it's this whole thing and then it's usually hit or miss for me. Like I really dislike Click, but I really like Pixels. So I don't know what it is with some of these Adam Sandler movies, man. Maybe that's another discussion for another podcast. Maybe we can rank the Adam Sandler movies, but I'm more akin to the Adam Sandler movies that have the heart, like a Big Daddy. Parts a Little Nicky. So that's kind of where I'm at on that. So this kind of fits. It works for me because he's not taking it over. And you mentioned the beginning of the movie. We see Chaz Darby, and he's living, in an apartment with his girlfriend, Kayla. Kayla's supporting him. He's trying to get a record deal. He goes to he goes to Judd Nelson, as you mentioned, the record producer, and he tries to give him his tape. But there's this rule about solicitation, which I didn't really think about until recently, even though this movie's like 30 something years old, and like I guess there are some legal things like you can't just give a tape to executive. An executive has to ask for a tape or something like that. So like unsolicited, unsolicited influence on the tape or whoever gives it to you or whatever. Like there was some interesting stuff there, and I have to look this up, but there's probably some legal stuff there that is for a reason. Like now that I think about it, it's like record executives go to the concert and not necessarily you go to a record executive give your tape. So I started to realize those things, and I was like, oh, I think this makes sense now more as I've gotten older. This whole like reason you can't take the tape thing. So of course he turns it down. He can't take the tape. So their thinking is, okay, we got to play it on the radio. But then he gets kicked out of his apartment by the girlfriend Kayla. So he moves in with the brothers, Steve Buscemi and Adam Sandler, Pip and Rex, and they decide, hey, let's try to get played on the radio. So they try to break into the radio station and force their way in to play their song, and they bring fake guns as well, and they're hoping not to use them basically, and they end up using them anyway, and that's where things get out of control. And you mentioned Dog Day Afternoon is the standard. I would say that's pretty much the standard, and I did see Airheads before Dog Day Afternoon, obviously. But when I did see Dog Day Afternoon, I was like, oh, this is where Airheads got all their ideas from and made fun of them. So it made Airheads a little more, enjoyable for me after I watched Dog Day Afternoon. Ironically, I guess, just the comparison of the way that they were parodying it, especially with the demands. I thought that was pretty funny. And I just think that the way it kind of escalates, I think, is really fun. Like the situation where it's like a small like break in. It's like, okay, we're gonna just hold these people up, and then people start fighting back, and then all of a sudden the cops come, and then once the cops come, word starts, getting loose because they're live on the radio still, and once people start hearing that there's these, gunmen in the in the studio, people start showing up, and a giant crowd forms, and it's almost like as in Dog Day Afternoon, but more of a rock concert kind of feel. And it starts escalating, and then you got Chris Farley there trying to, as a cop, trying to keep the peace and doing all that kind of shtick. And meanwhile, they're trying to play the tape inside, and some old school. I mean, I haven't seen this. I mean, I always thought this was like a kind of a standard, a reel-to-reel tape. There's basically you have two reels, and you have to play the tape on like live on the radio. And this was not even a thing back in the '90s. You know what I mean? Like they had stopped doing reel-to-reel. And it was just CDs and tape. And Brendan Fraser's character Chaz is like, I sound better on a reel to reel. And I was just laughing my ass off because like he could have just made the situation so much easier just to make a CD copy, but he didn't want to sacrifice the audio quality of his voice, so he brought the reel to reel version. And just art, just little things like that crack me up because there are artists that go out of their way to make like little sound changes just to make things sound better. Perfect example. Into the Spider or Across the Spider Verse just came out, and they had to redo the audio and re-release it a week later because a lot of the audience members could not hear some of the audio in the beginning and with some of the other characters. So that perfection for perfect audio, I totally understand, and I thought that was just hilarious the way they played that off. And then, of course, things go awry and the tape is doesn't work, and of course they have to find the backup tape with Kayla, and this is where I get a flashback because I never hung out in Hollywood in the '90s, obviously, because I was a kid. I was 6 years old. But man, Hollywood looked like a wild party scene, and it's not like that now. It's a lot more homeless. But Jerome, what are your impressions of 1994 Hollywood, LA, with the whiskey a go go or whatever, and just the bands? And you said you didn't like the Fozzy band, but this whole thing of Chris Farley going in the bar and just being a cop in a bar in the '90s trying to find Kayla. I thought that was one of the funniest scenes in the movie.
That was definitely one of the better scenes. I mean, look, Chris Farley is known as a great talent for a reason, and I think that this is the kind of role that I think he really excels at. Just coming in for 5-10 minutes of screen time, just coming in, getting his laughs, getting out. Like, I think that is where he excels. And I think when he has David Spade to play off of in both Tommy Boy and Black Sheep, I also think that is a clear strength. And I think that's why a movie like Beverly Hills Ninja maybe doesn't work as well, because he doesn't have somebody either to play off of, or he's kind of expected to be a lead role. And here's the other thing. So I've got a couple of observations for you, Brian. There was a rumor at one point that Chris Farley and Adam Sandler were going to be the next generation of Ghostbusters. Do you remember this rumor?
Oh, I've heard, and I think this plays into the rumor.
I think it's funny that Harold Ramis and Ernie Hudson are in this movie with Chris Farley and Adam Sandler.
I think that's a lot of that speculation comes from just the fact that they were casted all together in this movie, and I've heard that. We've all heard variations of it, like throughout the years. It's changed. I think every decade, it's like every decade has this rumored group of Ghostbusters, like that generation's group of comedy talent. Certainly for '94, that was like the rumors, but yeah, I certainly see it because there's all these connections with it. You know what I mean? So it wouldn't have surprised me if the Ghostbusters had come from this at this point. But yeah, just the casting again, and we mentioned the casting a lot, but I think there's a certain genius casting to the Michael McKean. Just his casting is so good because we know him as I forget his name in Spinal Tap, David St. Hubbins in Spinal Tap. And, he's playing this kind of like rock legend in Spinal Tap. But in this movie, he plays the radio station boss Milo, and he's just totally the opposite of that character. And he's more in a soft rock, and he's got that long ponytail instead of letting his hair hang out. And I thought at the time, like, I never knew, like, the importance of the casting until I saw Spinal Tap way later, and I started to recognize, hey, that's the radio guy from Airheads. And then I started watching Airheads again later on and seeing this. I think there's sort of a genius casting in that, for the fact that he was playing this rock legend, and all of a sudden he's in this other rock movie in the '90s now, because Spinal Tap is early '80s, and it was just kind of almost like a passing of the torch from like one rock movie to another. It felt like, and I think that a follow up to Airheads is I would do it, of course, because I'm a fan. But I would actually do it in a way where it's like a Spinal Tap mockumentary and a follow-up to the band. And, I would actually bring Michael McKean back because he's still alive. And, he would do a great job as, like, playing both the DJ and maybe, like, David St. Hubbins himself. You know what I mean? So there's a lot of things you can do with Michael McKean because I think he's so talented. And I think this role, even though it's so obscure, I felt like later on in life, just watching it, just like there's a certain genius to this based on the history. So I got to credit the casting in that. Excuse me. And then later on, things start escalating even more. You find out that one of the cops wanted to dig some dirt on Chaz, and you find out that he used to be like a nerd or whatever. And then he gives this big speech, kind of like in what Al Pacino does in Dog Day Afternoon, one of his big speeches in front of the crowd, and reveals that, yeah, he was a nerd, and if you don't like me anymore, I understand, and everyone still accepts him. And then people start yelling shit from the crowd, like I played D&D. And then you get Lemmy's big cameo, and he goes, I was at the high school magazine, and that was pretty dope, man. And they make a joke about Lemmy earlier that Lemmy is God, so that was a great little tie-in. So I like the cameos, man. They're working for me, and up to this point, I feel like this is where the writing gets lost, because at this point, I don't even know how you end the movie. Like, I think they got lost because the ending of the movie, there's not really a giant climax at all, right? Like, it's just, hey, we're gonna put on a concert outside, we're gonna get you this record deal. But we're going to film a music video outside, and then you're going to get arrested. And then once they realize that they're not playing the actual instruments, which I thought was a little odd, because that's kind of the standard. If you're doing a music video, it's like you're not, it's a backtrack. So I don't know why they were so upset that they weren't playing their own instruments for a music video, knowing that music videos are played with the tape in the background. So it was just very weird. And then they kind of just accept it and don't play. And at one point, I thought the other funny part, too, was that Chaz wipes his ass with the contract. So that was really cool. And also at one point, you find out the radio station is changing from rock to soft rock, easy listening soft rock. And at one point, the DJ, what's his name, Shark? The Shark, played by Joe Mantegna. One of my favorite characters in the movie as well. One of my favorite characters. And they just get into this fight, and it's really hilarious, and it becomes this clash of genres, basically. Like, you're soft rock makes more money. Yeah, but rock is better sound and better music, and blah blah blah. And they're it's the idea of corporate rock or corporate music versus rock music, and I like that clash of what it represented. And then it kind of leads to that big conclusion with the the concert or whatever. And then that's kind of it. You don't even see him get arrested. This is where I feel like they just kind of didn't know what to do with the ending, and then they just came up with this ending, and it was kind of like, okay, it was a soft ending, nothing big happens, and then they're playing in prison, which is, of course, a nod to Johnny Cash, live in Folsom County Prison, and
Blues Brothers,
as well, but they go triple platinum, and then that's it. So that's why my thinking is, if you ever do a follow-up sequel, you do it mockumentary style in honor of Spinal Tap. And just, you can have Brendan Fraser, Steve Buscemi, and Adam Sandler come back and just have a loose script. Not even a script, just give them an outline. And just do what they did in Spinal Tap. And then just have this, like, mockumentary about the history of the band, or the lack of history of the band, and go from there. Because I think there is enough of a cult following that you can get a small budget together for, like, a 90-minute, fake documentary and get the actors back together.
So, Brian, the problem is that Disney has already released a rock mockumentary this year, and it was called Muppets Mayhem.
I don't think that's a mockumentary. I've seen 2 episodes. It's very narrative heavy.
It's not directly a mockumentary, but I don't. Again,
I get what you're saying. But I'm talking full. Give us the full Spinal Tap. Give us, a host.
I think that's the exact reason they wouldn't do it, is because it would be too much like Spinal Tap. I think that's part of the issue. I think unfortunately, because of the ownership issues, we're probably never going to see follow-up. I mean, just finding this movie is a pain in the ass. I was not able to rent it on iTunes or Amazon. So people are probably having a hard time rediscovering this movie because it's not out there, and that's a huge problem. If you can't access a movie, people are not going to be able to watch it. But Brian, I want to play a game with you, not like Saw. This is not like Saw. I looked at the box office for August 5th, 1994, the weekend that Airheads opened, and I think I have identified why this movie didn't do very well. But Brian, do you want to take a stab at the number one movie of August 5th, 1994? It is the only other new release. So there were 2 new releases, this one and the number one movie released that weekend. Actually, I'm sorry, there were 2. But there was, what is number one? Take a guess.
I want to say Angels in the Outfield.
Angels in the Outfield was number 9 in its 4th week of release.
Wow. Okay, because I remember a day in '94 where I saw Lion King and Angels in the Outfield, but Lion King was earlier in the summer, unless Lion King had a giant run.
Okay, so what's your other guess for number one? Any other guesses?
Maybe Forrest Gump, but I think that's also not a summer movie.
Forrest Gump was number 3 in
Okay.
its 5th week of release.
Wow. So it was a summer movie. Okay. There's a lot of competition in 94, people. I would also say Shawshank, but I don't know if that was a box office.
Shawshank was a box office bomb. I think that opens up a little bit later.
Yeah,
You
that was a
mentioned The
bomb.
Lion King. The Lion King was number 7 in its 8th week of release, and at this point, it had already made $230
Man,
million.
August of 94. I give up because those were my big guesses of 94.
All right, so I'm gonna give you your top 10. Number 1, Clear and Present Danger, starring Clint Eastwood. That was the number 1 movie, $20 million. Number 2, this is why Airheads didn't do well, Brian. The Mask was number 2.
Oh, the summer of Jim Carrey, or the year of Jim Carrey, because 94 was the 3
Yep.
giant Jim Carrey movies. Yep.
This made $52 million in the first 2 weeks. This was a monster of a movie. I don't think people really appreciate The Mask, Dumb and Dumber, Ace Ventura. They really combined to turn Jim Carrey into a megastar. The Mask being in theaters is why nobody went to see Airheads, I think. That's my theory.
Yeah, because I remember being in a theater watching The Mask. So that makes a lot of sense. And then watching Airheads on TV like 2 years
similar.
later.
Yeah.
So there it is.
So Forrest Gump was number 3. The Little Rascals, also the other new release, was 4. True Lies 5. The Client 6. Lion King 7. It Could Happen to You 8. Angels in the Outfield 9. And rounding out the top 10 is Airheads. So not great. Opening the weekend at number 10 behind all those movies. And number 11 was Speed in its 9th week of release as well.
Yeah, that was a big year because I saw a lot of those family movies in theaters that summer. So, yeah, wow, that explains a lot. But in terms of the strengths, I think it's pretty clear. Like the casting was good, it's got solid performances. I think everyone did a good job. Um, I thought the clothing design, like I mentioned in the Encino Man episode, again the clothing spot on. But I think that was kind of a natural thing because that's what the natural look was at the time in 1994. So it still looks good, man, because it's authentic. And of course, the music choices, the song by the Lone Rangers, "Degenerate" is actually a cover. It's by a band called Reagan Youth, and it was like a cover from a punk song that they did in the '80s, and like it's actually really good on its own, the punk version. So, and I'm a fan of punk music in small doses. You know what I mean? So. I can hear the punk's like element to it because I was thinking like this sounds like a punk song, and then I found out that it was. So that actually makes a lot of sense. So, and then of course this is a great time capsule for '94. I mean you got like Hollywood Boulevard, you got MTV representation, you got radio stations and what their stories were going through, and a lot of changes radio stations were going through in the '90s. And you got the clash of corporate rock and the clash of old rock versus new rock and all that stuff, and they were making fun of grunge. So I think that's what works for me. And of course, not a lot of the jokes land, obviously, so that's kind of one of the weaknesses. And of course, the character development's kind of weak. And then, of course, you got like abusive relationships going on that seem to be just okayed by everyone. It's like, oh, she's kind of abusive to him. She hits him every once in a while. That's fine. That's normal. And of course, that's not normal. So that's it wouldn't fly today, I don't think. And that would have been a totally different situation in terms of what their relationship was if this
And
came out today.
spoiler alert, it doesn't get any better next week.
Yeah. I mean, it's only 4 years apart, but next week's episode is Gods and Monsters. We'll get to that in a second. But I think we pretty much covered all the strengths and weaknesses. I think we're in agreement with that.
Yeah, I don't really have a lot else to say about this. I think that this is very much in the vein of those 1990s comedies that we've talked about. And I think that, look, this is a reasonably budgeted movie that unfortunately didn't do very well. And I think this is an odd case. I feel like if this movie maybe had come out at a different time when The Mask wasn't in theaters, I think maybe it would have been more successful. Like if this had come out maybe a year later or something when it's away from the Jim Carrey hotness, so to speak. And I feel like SNL also, I think if this movie had come out in the DVD era, which was just a couple of years later and really got into full effect, I think if this comes out like 96 or 97, I think the box office is better. And I think the DVD market for this movie is just, I think it really excels the popularity. The other thing is, was this movie on TV a lot? Because I don't feel like this is the kind of movie that I would see playing on Comedy Central all the time. Whereas I feel like a lot of Adam Sandler and Chris Farley movies would just be on in perpetuity.
I watched it local. It was a lot on the Fox local station. I remember they played it a lot during the day of the summers because I remember having spending summers with my aunts in L.A. and during the daytime TV, probably maybe like 4 or 5 o'clock, maybe on like a KCAL 9, and then if they replayed it on a Fox station, it'd be like a primetime movie kind of thing on like a Wednesday kind of thing. So yeah, that's kind of how I remember it. And then, like I would say, movie premieres on TV are not nearly as big now, right? Like, or you know what I mean? It's more streaming. So yeah, I can kind of see why it kind of got lost in the early 2000s, I would say. Um, yeah, but I think, well, it doesn't help that the Blu-ray is $350 right now on eBay. You know what I mean? So clearly, like, people want to own this movie, but it's really hard to. So again, I don't know what the deal is there because Disney owns it because it is 20th Century Fox. So with that new ownership, I don't know what's going on, but yeah, that Blu-ray came out. It looks like in 2013, and they haven't done anything with it. And you would think with Brendan Fraser's run right now, and Adam Sandler being the kind of like the Hollywood. I wouldn't say he's a Hollywood giant, but he's definitely a big Hollywood player that he is in terms of like producing and making movies and stuff. Like, I don't see why you would not market to something like a Disney Plus or Hulu and one of those things where it's like, flashback to the '90s kind of thing, and you would see that in the queue. You know what I mean? Like they don't really do that with this movie, so it's very strange. But my MVP is Michael Lehman. I feel like he did the best he could in putting this together and what he was trying to do. But like I mentioned before, I think Amy Heckerling would have done a far better job with it. That's kind of this. I feel like this is her style of movie, but then she would just do Clueless, and I think Clueless is way better, of course, but and more memorable. But I think she made the right decision, even though I don't think she was offered this movie at all. But I think this was kind of her thing to do. And the best performance, Brendan Fraser. I think at all the cameos and all the people that are in this movie, he actually is the top performance. I think he's the one that's kind of taking it more seriously than everyone else, but that's just kind of the nature of his character because his character is really going to go for it all and wants to be, a big success. And I think one of the important things that he mentions in this movie is that he wants to be known for having one good song or just one memorable song, and that's kind of it. And that's kind of what DJ the Shark is kind of like taken in by, that whole thing about just for the art. And I think I think Pip and the other two, they're not really into it for that. They're really into it for the money and the fame. So that's kind of where I'm at on that.
I'm going to give best performance to Steve Buscemi. I think he brought some of the Reservoir Dogs energy into this movie, and I'm not saying he saved it, but I think in terms of who I was most invested in, I would say it was Steve Buscemi, and I like seeing him in this mode. I think so many times he ends up being typecast as either kind of a crazy person or a sad sack, and not to say that he definitely is that to an extent here, but I just think it's a little bit of a different energy that I appreciate. So as I mentioned, with June and July, I am dedicating my MVP award to the screenwriters because the writers are on strike. And I have to say this movie really pushes this to the limit. I'm still going to do it, but just know that my feelings on this screenplay are not positive. But Rich Wilkes was the writer of Airheads. So in keeping with the tradition that I've been enacting for the last 2 months, that is who I'm giving it to. But boy, oh boy, this script is a challenge, to say the least.
Well, I mean, the movies he would write next would be the entire Triple X franchise. So I don't know if that was an improvement or not, but yeah, that's for one to decide. But that's how if you're cool with Vin Diesel, I guess you're gonna like the Triple X movies more than Airheads. So there you go. So next week we're moving on to the year 1998, and it's Gods and Monsters, starring Ian McKellen with Brendan Fraser. And it's a different kind of movie. It's one of those period kind of pieces. It's a little it takes place in the 50s, and it's got a great look to it, but there's not really much of a plot, I guess. But it's mainly about the last days of James Whale and, his experiences living as a gay director in Hollywood and what that life was kind of like. But I don't know. We'll talk about it next week because it's kind of an interesting viewing. I wouldn't say it's something worth owning, or, I'd say it's like a one-time kind of view and that's it. But
it is
it's
on
interesting.
Paramount Plus. So
it is on Paramount Plus.
through Showtime, so that is how people can watch it. And it's going to be an interesting conversation next week, for sure.
For sure. So I'm Brian, and my co-host is Jerome, and we'll talk to you again next week, and we'll talk to you soon.
Just think, Brian, if they remade Airheads today, it would be the start of a candy universe.